Sienna didn't even knock. She pushed the door open, heels clicking on the hardwood, and spoke as if she were announcing a delivery. "This house is too big for you. Time to move out. We'll live here now." Her words hit the air like a stone through glass. Behind her, my son, my only child, kept his eyes fixed on the floorboards. Not a protest, not a single word. His silence cut sharper than anything his wife could ever say. I sat in my armchair by the window, the one Thomas and I had picked out at a flea market years ago. My hand tightened on the armrest until the wood pressed hard into my palm. I wanted to believe I'd misheard her, but the certainty in her tone left no room for doubt. Sienna set her purse on the entryway table as though she already owned it. She looked around, eyes narrowing at the wallpaper, the shelves, the photographs. Her expression carried that familiar mixture of disapproval and calculation, as if she were already stripping the place down to studs and repainting it in her image. "You'll be safer in assisted living anyway," she added, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "It's what people your age do." I opened my mouth but found no sound. My son shifted uneasily, rubbing the back of his neck. He glanced at me once, only once, before lowering his gaze again. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend this home, the one that had carried him from crib to college. I felt my chest tighten, though not from fear. It was something heavier, something colder. I could almost hear Thomas's voice reminding me of the years we spent making this house ours, the nights patching the roof, the mornings drinking coffee on the porch before work. Sienna's voice droned on about how practical it would be, how modern families lived together differently now. I barely heard her. My eyes had shifted to the framed photograph on the mantel, Thomas holding our son as a boy, both smiling like the world was safe. I swallowed hard, straightened my back, and set my coffee cup down on the side table. I knew in that moment that what had just begun wasn't going to end with one conversation. It was only the first crack in a fight that would split everything open. After they left that morning, the house felt strangely louder in its silence. I stayed in my chair, staring at the walls as if they might answer the questions spinning through my mind. Those walls had seen everything more than either of them would ever understand. When Thomas and I first bought this place, it was little more than a sagging frame on a patch of land no one wanted. The roof leaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and the floors sloped so badly a marble could roll from one end to the other. People told us we were foolish to even try, but Thomas only smiled and said, "It'll be ours." That's what matters. We worked until our backs ached. He hammered nails by hand and I painted trim with brushes that left streaks no one but us would ever notice. Some weekends we had nothing but canned soup for dinner because every extra dollar went into lumber or shingles. I sold my mother's locket to buy insulation. I picked up extra shifts at the flower shop just to cover plumbing supplies. Each sacrifice stitched itself into these walls, quiet proof that love could hold a structure together when nothing else could. The memories are etched here, too. Our son's birthdays when balloons crowded the ceiling and the smell of cake filled every room. Storms that rattled the windows while we sat, huddled with candles telling stories, until the thunder rolled away. Morning coffee on the porch. Thomas's laugh carrying across the yard as the sun rose. This house never judged us, never turned us away. It simply held everything we poured into it. And now, to hear it dismissed as too much space, too much burden, it struck like a betrayal, not only of me, but of him, of us. I reached out and let my hand rest flat against the wall beside me. The paint was cool under my palm, but I could almost feel the heartbeat of the years we'd built into it. Their words echoed still, but the walls reminded me this place was not a prize to be claimed. It was the vessel of a life. And I knew then the fight was only beginning. The demand to leave wasn't the first wound. It was only the deepest cut in a line of smaller ones, each sharp in its own quiet way. I can still hear Sienna's voice the night she pushed her plate back across the table. "Your pot roast is quaint," she said with a smile too tight to be genuine. "Travis prefers something lighter, more modern." My son chuckled awkwardly, as if her words were harmless, as if my hours in the kitchen didn't matter. I swallowed. My pride lifted the plate and told myself it was nothing. Another time I came home to find the living room rearranged. My armchair had been shoved into the corner, the photograph of Thomas and me boxed away on a shelf. Sienna stood in the center of the room, gesturing broadly. "It just flows better this way. Don't you think my son didn't even look at me for approval? He just nodded along, letting her erase the home I had shaped. Then came the offhand remarks. "That dress looks like something from another century." Or, "Do you really still use that old coffee pot?" Always said, with a laugh, always framed as a joke. My son would laugh too, patting her arm, and I would smile as though it didn't sting. But inside, each remark left a mark thin as paper, yet deep enough to bleed. What I noticed most wasn't her cruelty. It was his silence. He never once told her to stop. Never once reminded her that I was his mother, that this house was my home. His silence gave her permission, and permission turned to habit. Alone at night, I would sit in that corner chair listening to the faint creaks of the house, remembering when laughter here had been gentle. Those small cuts festered, and I began to see how easily kindness could be dismissed when no one bothered to defend it. By the time Sienna stood in my doorway, demanding I leave, those cuts had already prepared me. I knew the pain of being erased, and I knew it would not end with words left unchallenged. It was late, the kind of night when the house usually settled into its quiet rhythm. I had made myself a small cup of coffee to fight off sleep, and was walking down the hallway when I heard voices drifting up from the living room. At first, I thought the television had been left on, but then I recognized them, my son and Sienna. I stopped just short of the stairwell, my hand against the wall for balance. Their words carried clearly through the vent. "Once she's out, we'll sell this place." Sienna said, her tone brisk, like she was reading numbers off a list. "Easy 6 figures. We can finally get the house we deserve." A pause. Then my son's voice, low but steady. "She'll resist, then push harder," Sienna replied without hesitation. "She doesn't need this space. She'll get over it once we're settled somewhere better. We just need to hold firm." I felt my fingernails digging into the plaster, tiny crescents marking the paint. The wall was cool beneath my palm, but my body was burning. My son, my boy I had carried, fed defended, was sitting downstairs while his wife planned my eviction, and he wasn't stopping her. He was agreeing. I pressed closer, straining to hear more. They began talking about numbers, what realtors had told them about the neighborhood, how quickly the property would move on the market. Sienna's voice lifted with excitement, while his remained steady, resigned. Not once did he mention what the house meant to me, what it had meant to all of us. I backed away slowly, careful not to make the floor creak. My breath came short, shallow, as if the air itself had thickened. I returned to my bedroom and closed the door softly, my hands trembling as I turned the lock. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at the shadows stretching across the ceiling. Their plan was not about helping me or keeping me safe. It was about erasing me. Every sacrifice I had made, every late night and early morning, reduced to a price tag they could split. Sleep never came. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the faint outline of the window frame, knowing with certainty that nothing in this house would ever feel the same again. Lying awake that night, I found myself reaching back through the years as though memory could explain how we had come to this place. I thought of the first time I gave something up for him, the day he broke his leg sliding into second base. The hospital bill was more than we had in savings. I took off my wedding ring, the one Thomas had placed on my finger with shaking hands, and walked it to a pawn shop. The man behind the counter weighed it like it was nothing. I signed the slip with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, then carried the money straight to the billing desk. When college came, the expenses stacked higher than I ever imagined. Tuition notices, rent checks, endless books and fees. I worked mornings, arranging flowers until my fingers cracked from the cold water, then hurried to evening shifts at the diner. I told myself exhaustion was temporary, but his future would last. Every time I saw him walk across campus, shoulders squared, I believed it was worth it. Even the smallest things carried sacrifice. I wore second-hand coats through brutal Vermont winters so he could have new cleats for soccer season. I remember him running across the field, arms outstretched, shouting, "Did you see that, Mom? I always saw." I never missed a game, no matter how tired or broke I was. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I wondered what he remembered. Did he think of my ring as more than melted gold? Did he recall my hands aching after 12-hour days? Or had all of it blurred into nothing more than money delivered on time? The realization settled heavy in my chest. My love in his eyes had been measured in bills paid and needs met, not in the sleepless nights or the quiet pride that had kept me moving forward. I had given him everything, believing love would echo back in some form of loyalty. Instead, I was left with the echo of his silence and the knowledge that I had become a ledger line in the life I built for him. And in that silence, something inside me began to shift. Morning light poured across the kitchen table, and I caught my reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at me seemed older than I remembered, lines deeper, shoulders stooped. But it wasn't just age. It was the weight of years spent waiting for something that had never arrived. Gratitude, respect, a word of defense when I needed it most. I thought of Thomas, of how often he'd told me I was the strong one. I used to laugh at that, brushing it aside. But strength wasn't in lifting boxes or climbing ladders, it was in giving over and over without anyone noticing the cost. I had carried that strength in silence for decades, certain it would one day be honored. Now I saw clearly silence had only taught them I would never push back. Grief burned in my chest, sharp and relentless. For a moment it felt like it might swallow me, but then something unexpected happened. The grief hardened. It became something I could grip like steel, cooling into shape. I no longer felt like a woman begging to be seen. I felt like a woman who had been blindfolded, finally tearing the cloth away. I stood and opened the cupboard, running my hand along the mugs Thomas and I had collected over the years. Each one carried a memory, a proof that life here had been built with care. The thought of Sienna tossing them aside as clutter no longer made me ache, it made me certain she would never succeed. I had waited too long for my son to remember who raised him. I had hoped too many times that his silence was just hesitation, not choice. But choices had been made. His silence had spoken. As I poured the last of the coffee into my cup, the resolve settled fully into me. I would not leave this house. I would not let them strip away what Thomas and I had built. For the first time in years, my hands stopped trembling, and that stillness carried me straight to the small fireproof box in my bedroom closet. The closet smelled faintly of cedar from the old chest pressed against the wall. I bent down and slid the fireproof box out from its hiding place, the metal cool against my palms. For years I had touched it, only to move it, when cleaning, never to open it. But that morning, with resolve steady in me, I set it on the bed and turned the key. Inside, everything was just as I had left it. Folders labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting, our marriage license, insurance papers, and then at the very bottom, the deed. My name alone stood at the top, bold letters across the page. I traced them with my finger, as though the ink itself could reassure me. Beneath it was a thinner folder one Thomas had added in the last year of his life. My chest tightened as I opened it, the memory of those conversations returning with clarity. He had insisted we set up a trust clause, his way of protecting me after he was gone. "You'll need it someday," he had said. At the time, I thought it was his way of easing his own fears about leaving me alone. Now I understood he had seen further ahead than I ever imagined. The clause was simple, unyielding: no sale, no transfer, no change of ownership without my written consent. Not even my son's signature could override it. Reading the words, I felt a calm I hadn't known in months settle over me. All this time I had been bracing for a battle I thought I might lose, not realizing I had already been given the weapon to win. For the first time since Thomas's death, a smile spread across my face. Small, steady, but real. They believed I was weak, trapped, ready to be pushed aside. They had no idea I had been holding the winning card all along. I placed the documents back inside, locked the box, and tucked it carefully into its place. That night, I slept without waking once. The next morning, with the sun barely cresting over the ridge, I dialed my lawyer. My voice didn't waver when I told him I needed to review the deed and the trust. By the time I hung up, the plan had already begun. They began speaking more openly in front of me, as if I were no longer a factor in the equation. Sienna sprawled across my sofa one afternoon, with her laptop scrolling through real estate listings. "This place will go fast," she said, her voice brimming with satisfaction. "We could list it as early as summer and clear enough for a sizable down payment, maybe even in Brookfield." My son nodded, flipping through renovation ideas on his phone. "If we repaint, maybe stage it a little, it'll look even better. Open houses could start right after the kids are out of school." They spoke of this house as if it were already theirs. I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, slowly jotting a few notes in my ledger book. To them it must have looked like the quiet habits of an aging woman who didn't understand what was happening. In truth, every word they spoke was being filed away, every number and plan etched clearly in my mind. Sienna glanced at me once barely, then back to her screen. She didn't ask what I thought. She never did. My son, though, stole a look now and then, his expression tight with guilt. He never voiced it. His silence hung in the air, heavier than her arrogance. I stirred my coffee and let them believe I was harmless. I nodded when Sienna mused about ripping out the kitchen, or when my son mentioned updating the bathrooms. I even murmured polite agreement when she said, "It's wasted space with just you here." Inside, though, I was steady as stone. Their voices became background noise, the kind that hums until you forget it's there. I let them talk. Let them build castles out of air, while I sat with the certainty that none of it would ever come to pass. My silence was not weakness. It was preparation sharper than any argument I could have offered. And as I watched them plan a future carved out of my past, I knew the moment to end their fantasy was drawing near. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of day that began without ceremony. The air was cool, the sun steady, and for once, I felt lighter than I had in months. By the time Sienna's car pulled into the driveway, the locksmith was already stepping off the porch, his toolbox in hand. He gave me a polite nod before heading to his van. I stood at the edge of the garden, gloves still on my hands, the smell of damp earth clinging to my fingers. From where I knelt among the rows of tulips, I watched as Sienna marched up the steps, phone in one hand, coffee cup in the other. She slid her key into the lock, gave it a twist, and frowned when nothing happened. She tried again, sharper this time. The key refused to turn. "What is this?" she snapped, rattling the knob. Her eyes darted to the porch, where two suitcases rested neatly against the railing, hers and my son's. She blinked, recognition dawning, and then turned, searching the yard, until her gaze found me among the flowers. "You changed the locks." I met her glare without blinking. My voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried through the space between us. "This house is mine, and always will be. Behind her, my son climbed out of the car, confusion written across his face. He hurried up the steps, tested his own key, and found the same result. His jaw tightened. "Mom, what are you doing?" "What I should have done long ago," I said, keeping my tone even. Sienna's voice rose into a sharp edge. "You can't do this. We have plans, I cut her off with a look, not words. For years I had bent, softened, swallowed my anger for the sake of peace. But not now. Not when the proof of my ownership rested safe in the box inside. They shouted first at me, then at each other. I didn't respond. The sound of their voices no longer pierced it, only confirmed what I already knew. I stepped back into the doorway, hand on the frame, and let the cool air rush past me one last time. Then, with a steady breath, I closed the door. The latch clicked softly final, and sure as though the house itself had spoken. Behind the locked door, silence filled the rooms, but it wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of something turning, shifting, beginning. After the locks were changed, I turned to the other ties that bound us. For years I had been their safety net, the quiet answer when tuition came due, when medical bills appeared, when emergencies drained their accounts. I stopped it all. No more checks slipped into envelopes. No more transfers sent at midnight. The loans they never repaid remained unpaid. The cushion they thought would always be there was gone. At first, they tried denial. Calls and texts came daily, pleading, insisting, even accusing. I answered none of them. Then came the neighbors' whispers drifting down the street as Sienna's car disappeared for days at a time as late notices piled up on their mailbox. My son's voice grew hoarse from excuses. Work trouble, unexpected expenses, the economy. But I knew the truth. Their foundation had always been built on me. And without me, it crumbled. Weeks later, he appeared at my door alone. His eyes were red, his shoulders bent in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He stood there, trembling, words tumbling out with desperation. "Why are you doing this, Mom?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the child I had raised, but the man he had chosen to become. My voice was steady, almost gentle. "I raised a son. You chose to be someone else's husband." His lips parted, but no sound came. For a moment, I thought he might reach for me, but instead, he lowered his gaze. I placed my hand on the doorframe, took a slow breath, and closed the door. Not in anger, not in spite. In peace, inside the house exhaled with me. The silence was not heavy anymore. It was clean, sharp, alive. And so I turn to you, the ones listening. The ones who understand what it means to give until you are emptied. Have you ever been told you're too old to matter? When did family become a transaction? And why does silence terrify them if silence is all we have left?